All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I see the folks are responding to the prompt in the chat. Uh, a lot of representation, both from higher ed as well as from secondary high schools. So thank you for joining. I am William Hayes. We are going to go ahead and get started today. Shout out to Charlestown High School from Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you all for joining. I am William Hayes. We're going to do something a little different. We are actually going to operate this session from a Nearpod. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I know that some presentations are typically like sit and get, but this is going to be a little more interactive. And so you are welcome to turn your cameras on, join in, and engage in the discussion. Our secondary folks, those who are working in high schools might be familiar with Nearpod. And so Nearpod is an engagement tool that allows us to both split our screen in the Zoom session as well as interact in another app. And so right now I am dropping the Nearpod link to you all. You could go ahead and click on that and get the link. And if you can just go ahead and click on that link, it'll bring you to the Nearpod interface. Again, so you're going to click on that link. It shouldn't cost anything. It should only ask you to type your name, and I'll be able to see as you join. And so I have about 4 participants out of 23 who are inside of the Nearpod link. You can go ahead and join that now. I'm going to redrop that. Again, the presentation will be coming from the Nearpod, and so it's going to be important that you click in there so that you can see what we are talking about and what we're discussing. If you're having trouble getting in, just go ahead and type "I'm having trouble." I have 14 out of 24 folks inside of the Nearpod, waiting for about 10 more. And if you are having some technical issues or you're in transit, just go ahead and let me know so we don't delay in that regard. Got it. For those who are having trouble, sometimes it's also easier just to go ahead and put the code in if you're able to get to the Nearpod location. All right. So for the purposes of some folks needing to actually be able to see, I am going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to go back and forth and just make sure that everyone can get in and see. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. You can continue to try to get into that Nearpod if you can. I have dropped the link and all of the other pieces. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, I am William Hayes. I am working with Nes for Ed, along with my wonderful colleague, Joseph Goins, and I'm excited to be working with you all today to talk about equity, particularly in early college programming. And so for those who don't know, I am currently the founding principal of Mastery High School of Camden, New Jersey. This is my 6th year as a principal and super excited to be doing work with other secondary and post-secondary leaders. I was previously a principal in Cleveland, Ohio of a pre-K to 8th grade school in Cleveland Public Schools. And then prior to that, probably most significant to this conversation, I was a former BPS teacher and assistant principal at New Mission High School, home of the Titans, multiple state championship winners in basketball. Absolutely love that school, is where I got my start. I'm a graduate of Morehouse College and Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Vanderbilt School of Education. And so have some familiarity with the inner workings of Massachusetts at large, and most specifically Boston Public Schools. And so today we're going to spend some time talking, but I want to make sure that we are actively engaged in this process around equity. And so I want to get us started with students first, right? I want to have a conversation about the kids and how we can better serve our students. And so let's get started. Describe the individual and group profile of typical students in your early college program. You're going to type that right into the Nearpod document. You're going to type that into the Nearpod document. If you don't have access to the Nearpod document, you can type it into the chat. Again, describe the individual and group profile of typical students in your early college program. Who are they? What are their demographics? What are their learning styles? What are their motivations? What are their levels? Take a few moments to go ahead and do that now. So I see a lot of references to first gen, low income students, Hispanic. If you could type in details around gender, type in details around race, ethnicity. How long have they been in the country? How specific can you be about the general profiles of your students? Cheryl, it's fine if you type it into the chat if you don't have access to the Nearpod. And so one of the things we want to lift up is there's often a tension around discussions of equity, particularly school by school, right? And so we realize that many of you all are dealing with or supporting many different dynamics as it relates to student demographics. Some of you start earlier in 9th and 10th grade, some of you more appropriately around junior and senior year. Some of you are focused heavily on students from a Hispanic or Latino background. Others, there's a large population of Black or African-American students in your student profile. And so this just kind of norms us around the conversation of who's in the room and who we're talking about. Again, take note of who else is in this training and the demographics that they are working with in this conversation. And so as we move, I'd like for you to begin to think about, we're going to orient ourselves into the ways in which we view students and the ways in which we talk about students. And so what I'd like for you all to do, in a separate post, list all the ways in which a student could be identified, right? And so as we think about these conversations of equity, we're often talking about subgroups, right? And so it's important that we complicate the student pool. And so I want you to think about how many ways could you create a student identity marker. That can be a low income student, first gen, been in the country 2 years, students that are in 9th grade, 10th grade, a C student, an A student. Go ahead and type out that list of identity markers. You don't just have to type one, you can type a number of them. This will help us orient ourselves in the conversation to ensure that we're not just isolating one group in this conversation around equity, right? It's very easy for this to be caught up in a conversation around race, particularly like Black and white. We lose sight of a conversation around Latinx communities. We even lose sight around a conversation around like our immigrant students. Where are they coming from? Are our students from Mexico being more successful than students from Dominican Republic? When we think about how our students come to this country. And so we want to begin to complicate this narrative around who our students are in front of us as we have this conversation around equity. Because most important is that we don't lose sight of any students. And so it's important that we have someone committed to seeing all of our students in this conversation, particularly as you think about the mission and vision that you all have adopted for why early college programming is so important to close some of the disparities and gaps that we see within the outcomes of our students. And so thank you all for sharing that. Thank you for providing me with that information. It will help me kind of push the discussion and conversation in a direction that's going to be most beneficial for you all. And so the session aims today, we are going to review key terms in the historical context undergirding the need for equitable access for groups identified in the MA-ECP designation rubric. And so I'd like to ground it in the work that you're actually doing, right? We want to make sure that you walk away from this being able to take away something that you can actually use in your programming process. We identify evidence of equality and equity in early college programs and the potential impact on the access, opportunity, and outcome projections for marginalized groups. Again, thinking about how we close this gap that many of our students are experiencing as a result of the world that they live in, right? The contextual constraints that they have no control over. And then leaders will review a series of strategies for ensuring equitable access and opportunity for previously marginalized groups. Again, thinking about how can we take this session and directly apply it into something we can do tomorrow. You all should be very familiar with this particular strand, and so we're going to focus on these two strands taken from your designation rubric. When you look at the program presents an effective plan for outreach and recruitment of students who are traditionally underrepresented in higher education. This sets the stage for why equity is important, right? It's something you committed to when you applied to be an early college program, right? And something you don't want to lose sight of. And then the program design aims to reflect an admissions and placement policy that ensures that the highest number of first generation and other underrepresented students are able to participate successfully. And so if we're going to commit to that mission, right, that designation that got us here, then we have to constantly go back and forth to assess where we are relative to those goals. Session norms. I'm going to ask that you be fully present. I know that it is very difficult, particularly as a principal in this particular context, or a school leader or anyone working in education, to block off the door or block off the ping, the phone for an hour or a session, and so I want to give respect to that. I also want to respect the fact that you are all adults. You can decide when you need to go to the restroom, when you need to step away, when you need to cut your screen off. Speak your truth. We realize that we're coming from a number of different backgrounds, experiences, school makeups, but it is important that your voice be heard in the conversation. Listen and make note of what you are experiencing in the conversation. Take notes, jot information down, and then think through that and process that. Lean into the discomfort and the brave space. Conversations around equity are often very difficult because we don't want to be judged, right? We don't want to be judged for saying the wrong thing, and so we don't want to take a risk. And also realizing this is a brave space. We traditionally used to call it a safe space, where we felt like, we could speak our truth and there would be no consequences or repercussions. We've also since realized it is a brave space. These are your professional colleagues, right? And so there is some negotiation between what I can say or what I need to think about. We also know that Ms. Hunt is on the line, and she's, director and over all of this. And so what does that mean for my ability to engage in the conversation? And so I'm going to ask you all to lean into the brave space. And then accept non-closure, that you won't walk away from the session with all of the answers, right? But we are going to walk away with information that allows us to make some different choices that are going to benefit our students. Make sure. All right. Can I get a volunteer to type their name into the chat to read this out loud? Amanda.
Good morning, everyone. Listen for what surprises you. Notice what disturbs you. If what you say surprises me, I must have been assuming something else was true. If something you say disturbs me, I must believe something contrary to you. My shock at your position exposes my own. These moments are great gifts. Margaret Wheatley.
Thank you so much for that, Amanda. And so one of the things that's important is to relax, right? Conversations around equity are about individual growth so that you can impact the systems that you work in. And so you want to make note of what your body is experiencing, where things are being said that you're like, whoa, I don't agree with that. I'm not quite sure about that. This requires further investigation. When you start to listen to others, you start to take account of how you're feeling and experiencing information as it's coming to you. And so you begin to process where you stand in this particularly process and journey around equity. The equity process, right? We want to acknowledge that we're all on various points of this process and on this pyramid. We go from a level of unconscious incompetence, right? I don't even know what I don't know about this topic or this subject, right? You just kind of threw me in this work and I'm figuring it out along the way. And hopefully through information and development and discussion, we go through this period of conscious incompetence, right? I realize I have a gap in this particular area and I need to grow in this area. And so this conversation won't provide you all the answers, but it will provide you points of gaps, right? And you can decide, I want to further research this area. I want to dig deeper in this particular area. I actually need to follow up on this particular topic to know more. Then we enter into this conscious competence, right? This is where we start to equate it to like students who are struggling to learn a particular skill. And so they have to very intently think about it over and over again. You have to cross-check it, go back to the notes. And there's a point at which you transition into unconscious competence, where you just notice it and do it readily, right? You do it without thinking about it because the learning is so ingrained in who you are. And so the hope is that in this discussion of equity, we take what is happening individually, right? This idea that I am learning what I do not know, I'm becoming familiar with new skills, with new conversations, with new language, and then I'm going to translate that into the system I work in. And so ultimately, you want what you are taking away from this conversation to land with your students in your schools. And so before we dive in, I really just want to kind of acknowledge the fact I'm one of those people that when I come to PD, I hate to sit and listen to somebody talking to me the whole time. And so I typically structure PDs in such a way that allows you all to talk to each other, to express ideas and think through particular topics that are important to you. And so I'm going to send you to a breakout room. In your breakout group, discuss the following. What is equity? What does it look like in the context of early college programming? And how will you know when you've accomplished it? Okay. What is equity? What does it look like in the context of early college programming? And how will you know when you've accomplished it? I'm going to send you to your breakout rooms for 5 minutes to have a general discussion. All right, welcome back. So when people don't hurry back to the main room, it means there was some great discussion happening. So that is great to hear. Can I get somebody from group 1 to share out what you all discussed? Jenna, Maria, Rebecca, Shannon, and Yao. Someone, anyone.
All right, I'll hop in. I was gonna say, yeah, you want to go?
Got it.
Okay. Our group did actually not get too far from the first question. We started sharing our individual views of equity and the terms access, fairness, justice came up. We discussed the equality versus equity visual that most people picture of the folks on the fence and someone needing an extra crate. So that's what we talked about.
Great, thank you for sharing. And somebody from room 4, Carmen, Cheryl, Frank, and Ryan.
One thing we talked about was equity. And with equity, we were talking about equal opportunity for everyone to achieve the same results. So to have the same opportunity. And I think that's what we kind of narrow that down to in terms of equity. And in terms of early college programming, we got to that question too. We weren't able to get to question 3. But in terms of that, one way was seeing success stories of students who have made it and who were really successful through early college, and also through data gathering and kind of seeing what the numbers are through early college.
Absolutely. There is power in the data and power in sharing those stories. I want to point out one of the comments to Carmen's point around this third question, right? That's actually a bit of a trick question. How will you know when you've accomplished it? And it kind of sets the stage that we are driving towards a goal that we will have met the mark and then we are there. That is not the case. Even in this chart that we looked at around this building unconscious competence, it's an iterative process, right? And so even once I get to one level, I'm constantly trying to move to another level, a more nuanced understanding and a more nuanced ability to impact change for our students. And so it's not an end all be all, it is an ongoing iterative process that happens over time. And so I appreciate you pointing that out, Carmen, thank you. And so this is actually the image that many of you all were talking about when you thought about equity versus equality versus justice, right? And so we've kind of gotten to a point in mainstream education that we understand the difference between equality and equity, that we're not going to service our students by giving them all the same thing, right? That our students have different needs, require different supports. When we start to shift into this idea around justice, we look at it, all 3 can see the game, right? Because we've eliminated the barriers and constraints. And so that is actually more of a systemic approach to how we support students, right? Not just giving individuals the things they need, but thinking about how we can impact systems to remove the barriers that are inhibiting our students from their outcomes, right? And so as you enter into this conversation around our early college programming, you should be thinking about what are the barriers that are in front of our students that prevent them from not only accessing our programming, but persisting through our programming and going on to college, right? And so that's a constant evaluation and assessment of that process. And so what are some of the challenges you face in ensuring equity for all of your students, right? When you think about, you want all of your students to have access, you want all of your students to be successful, what are the very real challenges you face in ensuring equity for all of your students? Again, this is great information gathering for the state level folks who are listening to you all as you think about this work. What are some of the challenges you face in ensuring equity for all of your students? And so I'd love you all to navigate the space between both your own personal challenges as well as systemic challenges, right? If you wanted everybody to have access to this particular program and you wanted everyone to be successful, what are the things in place that are preventing that from happening? Aaron, can you unmute yourself and say more about scheduling constraints?
Sorry, I'm just changing the baby's diaper.
Oh no, that's terrible, sorry. And then he froze.
Block period, if there's not enough blocks in the day to accomplish, if students have like English learner needs, and also like students that require certain things, like just trying to fit everything in, there's not enough time in the day.
Right, very real kind of tangible, concrete constraint, right? Students who have needs also require additional support to respond to those needs. And how do I layer in early college programming on top of that, right? Peggy, could you unmute yourself and say more about transportation?
Hi, sorry, it takes me a minute. Where am I finding this? Just in terms of where we live, I've had students who have spent 3 hours to get to an hour and a half class by way of the bus system in Western Massachusetts. So transportation is a huge issue in our rural areas, let alone that assumes you can get a bus pass because you have the money. And it certainly assumes that if you're not taking the bus, you can get a car. Who has a car when you don't have money? So a lot of issues there.
Yes. As a secondary principal who's trying to do early college partnership with a school right up the street, transportation and scheduling are the two biggest nightmares when you are thinking about trying to provide for students in this particular program. Even well-intentioned people struggle to get kids all the courses they need to meet all the requirements and to get them to the locations where the courses are taking place. And so I want to acknowledge those very real constraints as we think about equity, which don't necessarily point to your intentions, right? You could want it for students, right? You could want to provide them all these opportunities, but there are very real constraints that prevent you from doing so. And so one of the things I would love to talk about when we think about equity is building this sense of urgency around why it matters, right? And context does matter in this larger discussion. And so I'm going to give you a few moments to look at these charts and orient yourselves to the framework that I'm looking at this work around equity through. Among college students at four-year institutions, if you look from left to right, 64% of students who are low-income students, 64% of those students, Black students, fall into that low-income category. 54.6% of Latino students fall into that low-income category. And 36.3% of white students fall into that low-income category. And so we're orienting ourselves to which students are landing in college, right? And how does that very much align to which students are in your early college programming? When we look at the percentage of students that have dependents, we see that far more students, Black and African-American students, are coming to school with dependents, meaning other responsibilities when they're enrolling in college. Same to their Latino peers as well. And then we look at financial independence, meaning can I reasonably assume that I'm going to have financial backing and support of parents or some other guardian when I get to college? 58.7% of our Black students are financially independent, meaning they don't have that support system outside of the college program. And then we look at the percentage of students that are first generation. Again, context that matters. I want you all to be listening to all of this and thinking about the sense of urgency it places on needing to ensure that our systems are equitable, not only in terms of access, but in terms of their outcomes. Additional context that matters. You've seen these charts before. Unemployment rates as it relates to advanced and post-secondary education, right? We see a decline in unemployment rates as students get more education. We see an increase in weekly median salary as they get more education. We also look at the graduation rates by race, right? We can see that after 6 years, total 40% of Black students have graduated from a four-year institution that they started at. We see how that number differs from their white counterparts, from their Asian counterparts, and the disparity that exists. We also see the larger percentage of students that are taking far longer to get through their post-secondary education. We can add additional context around the changing landscape of our country, right? If we look at this chart on the left, the percentage of white students versus the percentage of Hispanic students versus Black students in 2018 versus the projection in 2060. We also look at the percentage breakdown of students under the age of 18 versus above the age of 65. And so we see an increase in a majority minority population that is changing in terms of our student demographics. And so our schools must be able to respond to a majority minority population of students. And what are the implications for the ways in which our systems now need to be nimble and flexible enough to ensure equity across those systems? We also think about the historical context and implications of education, right? If we go back, we talked about the implications of increased income as it relates to post-secondary education. Look at the ways in which the disparity between household income. That top line is the top 5% of household incomes, that group, right? Look at the gap between the lowest. That is huge. That has implications for the loans that students are able to take out. That has implications for the support that they're able to get when they get into college. It has implications for their overall educational trajectory and what their schools look like, right? Because we do also know that property taxes have very much a huge influence on funding to schools. Is that a question, Peggy?
Yeah, I was wondering if you can, I'm just realizing that there are some folks who can't get into the open pod or the pod thing, and so they can't see these slides, which are such good slides. I just don't want folks.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm seeing 24 and 24. I was assuming that number was matching up. Somebody must be doubling up on the.
Oh, interesting. Well, I know that.
If you can't see, can you just let me know that I can't see and I'll share my screen? Sorry, I thought I had gotten to 100%.
Okay, awesome. Sorry, speaking up for a friend, and I don't want to out her, but she just did. Okay, bye. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Thank you. Less than 10% of children born in the bottom quartile of household incomes attain a bachelor's degree by age of 25. Right? That's back to this slide right here. The gap in terms of household income, the impact of your educational attainment on your household income. This is generational, right? And so if our students aren't getting the support to close the gap, it impacts future generations beyond them. And then additional context that matters. While we see a decline of the poverty rate over time, we see this gap is still huge, right? Double than their white counterparts in terms of the poverty rate. And then we see the changing landscape. The average income of high school grads has declined 12% during the past 40 years. Advanced degree holders, meanwhile, have enjoyed an 18% increase in income during the same time. And so there is a certain level of sustainability in having post-secondary education, a college degree, right? I believe Joseph and I were talking a little bit about the fact that in this pandemic, those that made above $65,000 a year prior to the pandemic actually saw a slight increase in their salaries, right? Where those that made it below $65,000 a year saw a decrease in their salary. And so education is serving as an economic buffer, particularly during challenging times. And so what does that mean for the urgency around our students having access to this? We also look at the changing makeup of the workforce, right? All this is in service to ensuring that our students have a sustainable life after high school and after they leave us. We see that in 1973, 32% of the workforce were high school dropouts, and 40% had a high school diploma. Look at what that looks like in terms of the workforce in 2018. Our workforce right now is not made up of people who dropped out of high school, and so it's our responsibility to ensure that our students get a high school diploma. We see a decrease in the number of students that make up our workforce who only have a high school diploma. And so post-secondary education becomes your ticket into the workforce. It becomes your ticket into sustainable living. It becomes your ticket into kind of this economic buffering and support system once you leave high school. Can I get someone to take themselves off mute and read this quote? Type your name in the chat and take yourself off mute to read this quote. My wait time is great. Anyone can type their name in the chat and read the quote. Kate, thanks.
In today's world, 21st century skill demands are steadily increasing. Most high-paying jobs require additional education and training beyond a high school diploma. We must make sure that our children, particularly those who are traditionally underserved, are prepared for and have access to post-secondary education. Governor Bob Wise, Alliance for Excellent Education.
Thank you. And so all this to say you have a case, right? You have a case for why this matters and why it matters now, right? Why we need to make sure that we get this right. Why we can't just create an elite early college program that only services a select few, right? And so if we're going to do the work of equity and closing gaps and responding to disparities, then we have to build the case for why it matters so much as we think about responding to our groups or our individual schools. And so I want you all to think about, how is an early college program a unique opportunity to provide both equity and justice for marginalized groups? I'm asking for you to do it quickly. How is an early college program a unique opportunity to provide both equity and justice for marginalized groups? What systemic barriers does it immediately address to close the gap for many students? You can go and get started on that now. I'm going to just share some of your colleagues' thoughts. Just feel free to take a look and make note and notice how you are either agreeing with or adding some nuance to it. Amanda, I'm going to share yours. I love the things that you point out here. Could you unmute yourself and say a little bit more about what you wrote?
Yeah, I think depending on our students' experience, especially if they're first generation, exposure to the experience of college, what that means in supports, what that means for careers that you may have never heard about, worked with anyone, pathways and opportunities. I think this gets at the systemic problem of not knowing what you don't know, and at least some kind of hopefully builds up some agency for students that may not have been exposed to that for all kinds of different reasons.
Absolutely. That was good. Great answer. Yes. And so you are building agency, right? You're building some of that social capital, giving them an early shot at it. I love these pieces around the financial implications of this, right? We are providing students an opportunity to get this done early, right? To get it covered, get it paid for, and to give them a leg up in this process. I'm going to move us on because I see we are moving close in time. This is where the work comes, right? I asked the question earlier, what would it look like if everybody could do this and everybody could get through the program, but why don't they? And so it is very easy to engage in a conversation that when we talk about why kids don't get in or why they don't make it through, we talk immediately about the shortcomings of the kids, right? We talk immediately about the deficits they bring, and we never do a lot of analysis on the systems or our own biases that prevent them from being successful. And so it's a both end, right? Our kids have very real needs and our systems are flexible and able to respond to them. We have to be intentional about recognizing our own biases. And so I'm going to give you a quick 45 seconds to read through this and then I'll talk through it. Okay, take a moment to read through investigating biases. All right, I'm going to send you to a breakout room. I want you to think about which of these biases most closely resonates with you. And I want you to think about it from a systemic standpoint, right? When we think about our early college programs, where do we see bias show up in our early college programming, okay? You're gonna have about 2 minutes and 30 seconds in your breakout groups to discuss. Where do we see biases showing up in our early college programming? All right, welcome back, folks. Can I get 2 volunteers to type their name in the chat to share what you discussed in your group? Just 2 volunteers. Leanne?
Thank you. I only did it because I kept trying to type on the last screen. I could see what everybody else was typing and I couldn't type my stuff in. But oddly enough, I was paired with my colleague, Sarah Batiste. So we're in the same program. So what we were talking about, and I don't know if we were reading all your biases wrong, but for me, it was motivated blindness. And I think it's because for me, I tend to focus, I think, on all of the positives on our early college. And personally, I tend to have a blind spot for that which is not going well. And then Sarah talked a lot about I think it fits in the first one, but we're not sure. But she makes a really good point that our early college students are judged unfairly, sometimes by our faculty, as not being ready or not deserving a benefit of the doubt, where another college student would get a benefit of the doubt and the early college students don't. And to add on to that, the early college students that are on our campus who are a little bit more maybe either extroverted or more self-advocating will step forward to Sarah and her team to get the support they need. But the ones who really need the benefit of the doubt are the ones who aren't so strong at self-advocacy, and they don't get it. It's like they can't catch a break, and we don't always know they need it. Do I have that right, Sarah?
Yes, I think you said that better than I could have. Thanks, Liam.
So I appreciate you pointing out particularly how these things show up. Step one, these don't make us bad people, right? We want to see all the great work that early college programming is doing. And in order to make it better, we have to find the gaps where we can improve and get better in the programming, right? I love that you pointed out this idea around like students not getting the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's in many cases, both at the front end of how we accept students into the program, how they persist through the program. And that actually falls into the sinister attribution bias, right? we are much more inclined to support students when we feel like the reason they are struggling is because of the system, not because of their motivation or their intellect or their ability, right? And so for the kid who's not performing well, we could say they just don't want to perform well and not even ask questions about the context that they're operating in. For the kid who doesn't speak up, we say, well, you could have done better if you just spoke up, right? Without inquiring as to why. And so it very much our inclination to support or shift a system in response to a child is very much driven by how we assign their outcomes, right? Whether it's assigned to the kid or the context that the kid operates in. And so we can actually think about this in a variety of ways. This is a large list of all the biases that we could look, right? The ways in which we hold context against kid, right? We come in with a preconceived notion, we confirm it. We have thoughts or a halo effect about a certain group of students based on our biases. And so we kind of lean in on their acceptance or their persistence. Other groups, we think it's your fault, right? And so there are a number of ways in which our system itself is biased toward or against certain students. And so we have to be consciously aware of how that plays out. And so in some of that question, I'm going to move through, how do systemic biases reduce or reproduce social inequity, right? At some point, we have to look at our system and say to ourselves, are we really helping the problem or are we further adding to the problem? And so when we look at this kind of a self-evaluation and reflection of your programming. And so realize that in some of your schools, early college programming is a program within the high school. Some of you all are early college high schools, and so everyone gets in. And so when we think about this idea of disparity and equity, we have to look at what are our student demographics relative to the larger population in every question that we ask, right? And so you look at this pyramid of total high school population versus early college program versus those who go off to college. And at every point, there are transition points to consider that you have to constantly reflect on in terms of your program. And so I offer these guiding questions. Who knows your school's EC program, right? Do all kids know about it? Who is eligible for the EC program? Are all kids able to access and get into it? Who actually applies to the EC program? Who gets into the program? Now, mind you, all these questions are asked far before we even talk about the program, right? And so there are certain biases that show up before we ever let a kid into the system. And then who persists, right? And so we have to think about each of our transition points into the EC program and through the EC program. Now, I'm a bit of a controversial person. I kind of like to toss a nugget in there to upset a few folks. Would students who persist through the college have likely done so without the EC program? Are we only helping kids who could have helped themselves? Who needed it that didn't get it? And who benefited from it the most, right? And so we are very comfortable talking about the needs of kids and how our system needs to shift at the beginning of the slide, and how programs like EC Early College can serve to do that. But when we look at the outcomes, we have to do a cost benefit, right? Are we really servicing those students who need it the most? And for students who struggle, what is it about our system that is not allowing them to be successful in that process? Because ultimately, when we look at the EC program, it has the potential to be a mirror and a window, right? And so if a kid asks those questions of who knows about it, who applies to it, who gets into it, who persists, who graduates from it, and they can't readily see themselves in their program, they're less likely to pursue it, and they're less likely to be successful in it. And if they don't see the EC program as an opportunity for them to navigate towards goals for people that look like them, then they foreclose on the opportunity altogether. And so you have to begin to figure out how effectively has your EC program developed both a mirror and window for the students that you've committed to servicing. Again, those first generation students, low income students, students of color, right? And so what does your program need to do to be able to respond to all of that? And so if we had more time, I would tell you to do this. Take a few moments to reflect on your own EC program by answering the guiding questions and the probing question. Where does your program land on the scale of being a reducer or a reproducer of social inequity? Who knows your school's EC program? Not just who did you tell it to, because it's one thing to tell it to them if they don't know it, right? Who is eligible for the EC program? Who applies to the EC program, who gets into it, and who persists? This is a very important and timely discussion because I believe we're kind of in the cycle where people start to talk about that next cohort of students in the EC program. And so you're going to have some latitude and some agency to determine what that program is going to look like and what the system is going to look like, right? It's not too late to tell more kids about it. It's not too late to show more kids how they can fit in it. It's not too late to ensure that your systems are equitable so that kids have access and opportunity to get into the program. And so I would encourage you to document these questions and to think through them both as your own individual self and then as a larger leadership team making many of these choices. And so these are my kids, right? And so I love to close out just like telling people about my students. These are all students that I desire to be in our dual enrollment program that we partner with a community college up the street. Jose is actually a student that arrived to us his sophomore year, overaged and undercredited from Mexico. And so what does that mean for the school that I need to provide to him? And what does that mean for my decision? Can he do early college? Are there things that needs to happen in his experience before he enrolls in the program? Or do we automatically say that this is not for him, right? I have on the right Ramir. Ramir is one of our students that transferred to us. He had been retained in 9th grade from his previous school. Genius, got into a lot of trouble. How do I support Ramir in accessing this program? What are his needs that are different than Jose? How can my school respond to all those needs of the students, right? In the same way that the students on the bottom have their own unique needs and situations and circumstances, we have to add faces and names and stories to this EC program and what we want to be successful. The mission is powerful. I think that what you all are committing to is extremely amazing. It should be adopted across the country. And we have real work to do to ensure that all means all, right? That at some point, all of our students can actually access this, not just access it, but be successful in it and through it, particularly because we know how important it is and the opportunity that exists. And so that's one of the other program questions. What are the barriers to more diverse students populations gaining access and being successful in dual enrollment programming? These are things that we have to constantly be thinking about from an equity lens. And then finally, we think the causes of these differences are unequal and inadequate educational opportunities, not inherent differences in capability or character. Our student success is not dependent upon their capabilities and character, right? That matters, but what matters more importantly is the educational opportunities that are in front of them, right? The equitable systems we create for them. And so I'd love to hear from you all. I'm going to drop this for you all. I'm going to ask if we can send it out. These are a series of steps that can be taken. And this is the screenshot, the screen grab, right? I wish I had left about 10 more minutes to go through this, and I'll probably push it to actually the next cycle for us to dig through these particular solutions. But these must be our regular rhythms for ensuring systemic equity, that we establish an understanding of race, equity, and inclusion principles. What is our philosophy and mindset around this work? We engage affected populations and stakeholders. Are we talking to students? Are we talking to teachers? Are we talking to the higher ed folks and the students at the high school? Gather and analyze disaggregated data. We must constantly be looking for those identity markers and how they show up in our system, both before they get to us, when they're with us, and after they leave us. System analysis of root causes. Why aren't kids being successful? Why aren't kids getting in? And then we begin to identify the strategies and conduct experiments and assessment and do this process over and over and over again. Again, because at no point are we trying to just reach this pinnacle of success, but it's an iterative process that we do over and over again, okay? And so that is my time. I am committing to picking up here in the next session so that we can begin to talk through some of these solutions once we've got to the mindset around the work.
Thank you, William. And as a reminder, follow-up session will be March the 2nd, and I'll send everybody a survey shortly. Thank you. Thank you, William.
Thank you.